Feminist Digital Pedagogies Conference. And I'm excited because now you're going to spend a couple hours with my crew. So this last session features the women of the Crunk Feminist Collective, otherwise known as the crew. And I'm going to introduce them individually, and then we're going to do a panel entitled Percussive Pedagogies, Teaching and Being Taught Feminism in Digital Spaces. So to my immediate right, we have Professor Robin Boylorn, who is an assistant professor of communication studies at the University of Alabama, where she specializes in interpersonal and intercultural communication. Robin is the author of 2 books. Her monograph, autoethnography entitled Sweetwater, Black Women and Narratives of Resilience, is an award-winning manuscript. And then she just published a second book all in 1 year, entitled Critical Autoethnography, which is a textbook, with her colleague Mark Orby. And Robin got her PhD from the University of South Florida, and she blogs for the CFC as Crunk. As R. Boylorn. She is quiet Crunk. And then next we have Isha Pandit, and so I'm going to read a little bit of Isha's bio because she's sort of a Renaissance woman and has many different things going on. So Isha is a writer and activist who believes in social justice movements, the power of intersectionality, feminism, sisterhood, and the power of art. She has written for CFC, The Nation, Feministing Salon, RH Reality Check, Feminist, and In These Times. And she's appeared on CNN, HLN, MSNBC, and Grit TV with Laura Flanders. Most recently, she was executive director of Men Stopping Violence in Atlanta, a social justice organization dedicated to ending men's violence against women. She served as women's rights manager at Breakthrough, a global human rights organization. At Breakthrough, she worked on the Bell Bahow, or Ring the Bell campaign that asked men and boys to take action, get involved, and help end violence against women. She has also served as director of advocacy at Raising Women's Voices, which is a national initiative working to make sure women's voices are heard and women's concerns are addressed as policymakers. She has served as Associate Director of Programs at the Civil Liberties and Public Policy Program at Hampshire College, where she coordinated the organization's New Leadership Networking Initiative. She worked with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University and Amnesty International's USA Women's Rights Programs. And she currently serves on the board of the National Network of Abortion Funds, which is, I know, a program near and dear to her heart. And she often asks us to contribute so that women will have access to abortions when they need them. She has a BA from Mount Holyoke and an MA from the University of Chicago. She blogs for the CFC as Isha P, and she's our resident policy wonk. So she has this sort of amazing ability to communicate really tough kinds of intricate pieces of legislation and things that are happening in reproductive justice policy and human rights and health policy, all of these things for our readership in a way that's accessible, but that's also really attuned to the concerns that animate us in women's and gender studies. So that's one of the things I admire most about Isha. So to Isha's right is Susanna Morris, and Susanna is recently tenured Associate Professor of English.
Appreciate it.
At Auburn University. She also just published her first book, Close Kin and Distant Relatives, Black Women and the Paradox of Respectability in Black Women's Literature, right?
Indeed, yeah.
From the University of Virginia. So, it's out like this month, right?
February 13th.
It just came out last week.
And so, Susanna blogs for the CFC as Crunkadelic. She's a specialist. She is my wonder twin. That is a thing you should know. And that is because when we were in graduate school together, people mistaked us for one another.
Oh.
We were the same person. Yeah.
Yes.
We are the same person.
We are the same person. And so, and also, so she is a specialist in contemporary African-American and Caribbean women's literature. She also writes about feminist speculative fiction. She has a project in the works that's about Octavia Butler and Joel Gomez and a lot of other cool folks. And then when she's not doing all that, she's a fierce gamer chick. So I think you would know.
Renaissance woman of another sort.
Oh, and I can't forget, she is also Lola's human.
A cat lady.
Yes. Lola's,
okay,
that's
it's
her
fine.
cat, and she is Lola's human.
That's true.
It's true.
That's what you
I
are.
own it. It's fine.
And then to her right, we have Dr. Cherie Davis Faulkner, who is, let me get your title right, Cherie, because you have 50 million things going on too. So Cherie is an interdisciplinary scholar working at the College of Liberal Arts at Georgia Institute of Technology to develop university and community partnerships in West Atlanta. She got her PhD from the Graduate Institute of Liberal Arts at Emory in 2012. She's an Atlanta native, and she currently works across higher education institutions in Atlanta to advance coordinated engagement and accountability that enhances the educational landscape of youth and students in adjacent communities. So it's like yesterday when I saw Cherie, she was like, so what I have in the works is a plan to get a house, to get a building that's going to become a community center for some people over in this sort of very impoverished area. And that's how Cherie thinks and works. So she is very committed to this sort of hands-on praxis around food justice, around accessibility, around making educational spaces open to all folks. So she's coordinated a number of cool initiatives, one of which was they coordinated an initiative at Georgia Tech where they had doctors come out and go jogging with folks from the community, just like go on walks or jogs with folks from the community, with the sort of narrative being that maybe you wouldn't talk to someone in a formal setting because you had to pay or you felt intimidated, but if you're just out on a walk together, perhaps you will share health concerns and get relevant information. So she's really an innovator in terms of thinking about how we do university community partnerships. She also teaches courses online and teaches courses about the sociology of poverty, right, and social justice for both Spelman and Georgia Tech. And she is the mother to our Crunk son, Naeem Faulkner, who's a brilliant kid and at the age of 66 will beat your chest. And also her Crunk Feminist husband, Treston Davis Faulkner. So, welcome the CFs.
Yeah.
That's right.
I'm Brittany. I'm Brittany Cooper. I'm an assistant professor in this department and also the Department of Africana Studies. And I blog for the CFC as Crunktastic. What we want to do is talk about this notion of percussive pedagogy, right? So we have theorized percussiveness as being at the heart of how we understand crunk and feminism, which are some terms that we put together. And Susanna is going to tell you a bit about crunk feminism in a moment. But by percussive, we mean bringing together disparate elements and having them make noise. And then our job is to sort of make sense of that noise, right? To take things that are dissonant and to think about that kind of dissonance as being productive. So we really think that one of the things we do well as a collective of bloggers and activists and scholars is to put to capitalize on a kind of contrary approach to pop culture and social justice work, where we're always thinking about what lies in the tension between academic and activist spaces, between popular culture and rigorous scholarship, etc. So that's what we mean by percussive, and today we want to think about what happens when you put scholarly and non-scholarly objects together, and what kind of teaching possibilities or pedagogical possibilities does that allow for. So we think it's really important to showcase some of the work that we do, because we run this blog and we blog there at least once a week and do a significant amount of unpaid labor of love. And we want to, so what we're going to have folks do, but that labor is also often disembodied for our reading audience. So we're going to have folks read from some of the pieces that they've written, and we're going to do that after Susanna gives us a little bit of the history of the CFC.
So the CFC, the Crunk Feminist Collective, was founded in 2004, thereabouts. So Brittany and I, along with some other folks at Emory University in Atlanta, were graduate students getting our PhDs in various disciplines, English, American Studies, Women's Studies, and so on. And this was during the time where crunk music was becoming sort of nationally known. Crunk music, a particular kind of Southern-based hip-hop, bass laden, beat driven is how we've talked about it on our website, was becoming sort of nationally known, although it had been a part of the Southern landscape for a long time before that. So we're in graduate school. Crunk music is a popular thing on the radio, but people are also taking the word crunk and using it to describe their lives, right? Our lives. And so rather than sort of just talking about crunk as, I got crunk at the party, I'm dancing and I feel crunk, we would say things like, girl, I was in that class and I had to get crunk with my classmates because they were saying racist things, sexist things, ableist things, what have you, and I really had to check them. I really had to check this person in this space. I had to get crunk with them. And so we were coming into our own as feminists, and we put the words together. Well, we're not just crunk, we're not just feminists, we're crunk feminists. And so it sort of started out a little bit as a joke, right? Like, I'm a feminist that gets crunk, and then we're like, actually, those things work together, right? They're percussive, but they make sense. They produce a kind of noise that helps us sort of make sense of our world. So that was 2004, and we all kind of went our separate ways after graduate school. But then in 2010, Brittany and I were both youthful assistant professors, and I was at Auburn and still am, and Brittany was at the University of Alabama, and so we were fairly close to each other, but a lot of our other folks were far. Folks had dispersed in the course of graduating or pursuing other opportunities, and we were thinking about having a feminist community because we had to continue to get crunk. Right? I mean, you don't stop getting crunk when you get a PhD or a master's or a BA or whatever. There are situations where you're like, so what you're not going to do is that kind of behavior, that sexism is not going to fly. Actually, I'm going to support you in being your full self. That's how we're going to get crunk, whatever it means. And so for us, that meant creating a community where it would be viable for us to communicate with one another. It wasn't going to cost anything because we didn't have any money, and that we would be able to sort of build community with others. So that's how the CFC blog was born in 2010. We invited a bunch of folks. Some people were friends, some folks were colleagues, and we formed a collective in which we said, we want to have this particular kind of online community, but it's had these in real life reverberations as well. So it's going to be 4 years soon as an online thing. So, and 10 years.
Yeah. Don't say it.
So, absolutely, that's the birth of the CFC.
Yes. So what we're going to have folks do is read a little bit about, so again, we blog. Our blogs are designed to try to make feminist concepts accessible for all audiences of people and facilitate online conversation. So we're going to just start to my right and have folks share a little bit of the kinds of things they write.
Okay, so I'm going to read from a blog post that I did called Mama's Feminism. I don't have a lot of feminist friends, at least not the kind that self-identify as such. My non-academic friends don't see themselves as feminists, don't call themselves feminist, don't all the way understand why I'm a feminist. They spend a lot of time trying to resist myths around being black and a woman and don't have the energy or motivation to also resist myths of feminism, of bra-burning white women who hate men and stand in picket lines, of black women who understand the theoretical nexus of their lives and initiatives that connect them to the cause, but become disconnected from movements close to home. Feminism was a term born in academia in an environment that polices people's behaviors to dictate who can and cannot be feminist and what is and is not feminist. Feminism as a way of life was born at my mama's house, in a space that made woman power and intentional equality a survival strategy and a mechanism to make up for the oppression, absence of men, and lifestyles that were without the luxury of adhering to strict gender scripts. I learned feminism from my mama and them, rural black women who did not have the benefit of formal college education or fancy words for how they lived. They would have no doubt by strict standards in the vulnerable moments of their lives that were necessary for sanity and survival being called unfeminist, while the world called them unfeminine. They would have had little investment in either label, learning from experience how dangerous it is to let outside people dictate your inside thoughts. They would have been resented for the ways that they were conditioned to desire men and canonical lifestyles while being mama and daddy, bringing home all the bacon with multiple mouths to feed. Their lifestyles were feminist, but their dreams and desires of being kept women with white women's problems would have been read as problematic. They would have rebelled because they wouldn't let a label like feminism tell them what to do. They wouldn't give a damn what people thought. I learned and realized I was a feminist from a teacher who described my mama without saying her name, gave her secrets away without giving her credit, and put struggling on a pedestal. We didn't have pedestals at my mama's house, but we had stools to stand on and sit on for work and rest, and feminism was like a metaphorical stepping stool. I got my feminism from my mama, even though she doesn't know it, and my grandmother and my aunts. They had a feminism that would fight back and hide behind the mask of smiles or scorn. My mama's feminism was wrapped up in God and respectability politics she could never live up to. My grandmama's feminism was housed in her meanness and caution. She carried it with her for emergencies and for protection, like the cigarettes in her pocket and the gun in her bra. My aunts held their feminism in their laughter and occasional anger. They used it to cover up pain. They didn't know they were feminists. They didn't mean to pass it on to me, but they couldn't help it. My mama's feminism is inherited but unnamed. She taught me how to own my feminism like I own myself. She taught me how to be a feminist by being herself. My feminism needs space to breathe and room to stretch out. My feminism never gets old. It is quiet sometimes. It listens to hip-hop and gospel music, watches soap operas, and likes to be heard. My feminism shows up in the bedroom and the classroom. It asks for what it wants, doesn't apologize for what it needs, and isn't afraid of being alone. My feminism is androgynous. It loves football. My feminism is soulful and historic, sexual and conscientious. It is standoffish and suspicious. My feminism needs to drink more water. My feminism has daddy issues. It talks back, snaps back, hits back, and doesn't take any shit. My feminism kicks ass and takes names. My feminism says no. My feminism cries sometimes and doesn't cover its eyes in shame. It gets mad sometimes and doesn't try to explain it away. My feminism is peaceful in practice but ready for combat. My feminism is in conversation with other feminisms and makes room for difference. My feminism takes mental health days and moves on when people walk away. My feminism loves Jesus and critiques the church, wears black fingernail polish and red lipstick, and loves reality TV. My feminism is homegrown, evolving, unapologetic, and beautiful. My feminism is opinionated. It questions everything. My feminism is not always right, but it's never wrong. My feminism gets tired. My feminism is anti-racist, anti-sexist, and conscious of class issues. My feminism knows what misogyny means. It takes days off. It tells people off. My feminism, like my mama, is braver than me, stronger than me, and keeps me grounded. My feminism, like me, is complicated and full of contradictions. My feminism is crunk. My feminism has dreams.
I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to do what I, sort of a piece that's kind of characteristic of what I write for the blog, which are conversations around the political work that I'm doing. This is a piece that I wrote this summer. It's called Reproductive Injustice and the War on Women, or An Ode to the Intersections. These days, it's hard to read something in regards to feminist activism without hearing the phrase war on women. Despite important and sharp critiques regarding the limitations of the phrase, it continues to hold cachet as means to characterize the depth and fortitude of the conservative legislative attack on women's reproductive rights. This attack is characterized by many organizations as the fight for access to reproductive rights includes a full-out state-based legislative strategy to restrict access to abortion via attacks on Medicaid coverage, bans, mandatory ultrasounds, forced waiting periods, fetal pain bills, impossible physician and hospital requirements, mandatory parental involvement, and state-mandated counseling. Given all this, it's hard to ignore the fact that there is indeed a deluge, a river of reactionary, regressive political actions, one after another in swift succession, with the clear goal of making reproductive health care inaccessible. Earlier this week, this was, I think, August this summer, or June, the Center for Investigative Reporting released a report revealing that between 2006 and 2010, doctors under contract with the California Department of Corrections sterilized at least 148 female inmates without the required state approvals. The report, informed by the advocacy work of Justice Now, found that coercive sterilizations occurred at both the California Institution for Women in Corona Valley and Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla. And I quote the report. One former Valley State inmate who gave birth to a son in October of 2006 said that the institution's OB-GYN, Dr. James Heinrich, repeatedly pressured her to agree to a tubal ligation. As soon as he found out that I had 5 kids, he suggested I look into getting it done. The closer I got to my due date, the more he talked about it, said Cristina Cordero, 34 years old, who spent 2 years in prison for auto theft. He made me feel like a bad mother if I didn't do it. Cordero, released in 2008, now living in Upland, California, agreed, but she says, today I wish I would have never had it done. Let's pause here and take note of the eugenic history of the California Department of Corrections. In 2003, the California State Senate held hearings to discuss and shed light on the state's history of eugenic practices, which included the sterilization of about 20,000 men and women between the years of 1909 and 1964. So significant and well-known were these eugenic practices that historians say Nazi Germany sought the advice of the state's eugenic leaders in the 1930s. Researchers documented these findings and presented them to California legislators, resulting in formal apologies issued by then Attorney General Bill Lochner and Governor Gray Davis. Further actions against the abuses suffered by the incarcerated in California prisons and jails are again in the spotlight. So just a quick note there is that I hyperlink to all of those things so you can see some of those apologies and you can see what I'm talking about when I say the recent things that were going on in California. While it's certainly true that some of the women who received these tubal ligations did so willingly, here we must remember the structure and function of coercion, which relies on a distorted power dynamic in which women often asked for consent while pregnant or in labor, not to mention the racist statements made on the record by many of the prison officials performing these sterilizations. The next section is, since Texas State Senator Wendy Davis stood on the floor of the Texas State Senate and filibustered for hours on end, my email inbox is flooded with requests for support and solidarity and fundraising. These requests have been heartening to me. As a longtime abortion fund volunteer, I know firsthand what happens when clinics close, when further restrictions are placed on women as they fight to get access to basic health care. Poor women, young women, women of color, queer and trans people, those that live in rural communities, people with disabilities, and numerous others who live at the margins of access to health care are all at the center of this fight. The fight happening right now in Texas is one in which the politics of intersectionality, the linking and overlapping and diverging institutional oppressions are in full force. The communities most affected by the regressive House Bill 2 live at many different intersections. It's in solidarity with them, us, that I give to abortion funds in Texas. It's in solidarity with them, us, that I demand an intersectional analysis that names, accounts for, and addresses the multiple forms of oppression that so many of us face. Clearly then, if there were a war on women occurring in our country right now, it must include the kinds of reproductive rights violations that occurred and are occurring in California's prisons. Coercive sterilizations must be counted amongst those egregious violations, no? The ability to control one's fertility without coercion or constraint is a central tenet of even the most mainstream reproductive rights organizations. Where, then, are the action alerts from the reproductive rights organizations? Where are the protests outside California prisons? Where are the marches and rallies and the email blasts asserting that these actions, sanctioned by the government, are a violation of women's human rights? Who we must ask are the women in the war on women that many feminist organizations are decrying. Are they the forcibly sterilized at the hands of the state? Are they the trans women that face repeated acts of aggression in the form of hate crimes at the hands of law enforcement officials? Are they poor women of color, immigrant women, queer women, and Native women navigating a foster system that makes the right to have a family a matter of demonstrating fitness to parent? Are they queer immigrant women fighting to keep their families together while navigating a punitive and racist immigration system? Who are those women? Am I one? The campaign and communications director at Justice Now, Courtney Hooks, described the connection between the fight for the rights of incarcerated people and the fight for reproductive justice. She said, one of the key tenets of reproductive justice is for people to be able to have a child, not have a child, and parent the children they have, whether through premature death due to overcrowding, violence, and severe medical neglect, being locked up throughout one's reproductive and family formation years, being cut off from one's children and loved ones via long distances, exorbitant phone fees, and visit denials, receiving abysmal baseline reproductive health care while inside that cuts one off from a full range of reproductive options and or results in de facto sterilization. Imprisonment interrupts the human right to family of communities of color and communities living in poverty and targeted for lockup. Imprisonment and the sterilization abuse that happens behind bars is a reproductive justice issue. To ignore these women, these incarcerated bodies, seems to me more than a mere oversight. It is more than a political mistake born of limited resources and an onslaught of attacks. These limited resources are a reality, as are the political attacks on bodily autonomy. It is more than political expediency and the lowest common denominator politics to which we've become accustomed, from right and left alike. The notable absence of this story in mainstream feminist conversations, as well as mainstream progressive and prison reform movements, implies, however, that this might be an issue for a different movement. The agency, autonomy, and human rights of women in prison is not seen as a mainstream reproductive rights issue or a mainstream progressive social justice issue. That is a mistake, because it is an incomplete, inaccurate, and heartbreaking representation of what could and should matter to feminist social justice activism. Also because it fractures us as a movement at a time when we need more concerted efforts, more power sharing, and more collective strategy if we are to overcome the destructive political forces that we're facing. In more ways than one, an intersectional politic is a matter of survival.
And take a feminist analysis to it in ways that are not always appropriate when you have to cover, say, American literature from 1865 to the present, you know? So that sort of informs my reading. So this is called Django Unchained and Why Context Matters. There are some spoilers, but the movie has been out for a while, so it's on you. Growing up, I had to deal with my mother's love for Westerns. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the outlaw Josie Wales. One of the many joys of expanded basic cable, besides the cooking channel, of course, is that I get encore Westerns. Between that and reruns of Walker, Texas Ranger, I know that my mama comes to visit. When she comes to visit, she will be thoroughly entertained. I don't get her love for the genre. I mean, I get it on one level. I know my mother appreciates a good revenge tale, and she likes it when the bad guys grovel at the end. But Westerns, really? Then again, I unapologetically look forward to watching The Real Housewives of Atlanta and all iterations of Love and Hip Hop, so who am I to judge? We all hold contradictions, not to mention shamtastic and raggedy entertainment choices. So when I saw that Django was coming out during the holidays, I thought this would be something that we could watch together. I mean, I do enjoy an episode of Walker, Texas Ranger now and again, but I'm not sure that that counts. Django would definitely give us both something to talk about. I did have some apprehension about watching Django, though. For one, I'm not a Tarantino fan at all. At all. Generally, I find his work contrived, overly self-conscious, and frankly, boring. Plus, to me, he's like the worst kind of hipster racist. A grown-up version of Justin Timberlake desperately trying to affirm his black card at all times, while thoroughly proving himself to be white as hell. The living works. But I was still intrigued by the movie. As a scholar of African American literature, I'm always interested in how we understand and talk about slavery today. Besides, I love Kerry Washington with a fiery, burning passion and would watch her read the phone book.
That's true.
Too bad she had like 5 lines in the movie, but she did have that lip quiver, though. Can't forget the lip quiver. I ended up watching the movie and it exceeded my admittedly low expectations. I'm not going to do a formal review here, largely because I think the film has been discussed elsewhere in brilliant ways and who needs to reinvent the wheel. And I linked to discussions of the film by Salamisha Tillett and in the Feminist Wire. So if you take a look at the post, you can look at really great formal reviews of the film. What I do want to talk a bit about was my movie-going experience. I decided against seeing Django while I was spending the holidays at home in Fort Lauderdale. I anticipated that my little heart couldn't take it. I imagined some irreverent scene involving slavery and being in a movie theater filled with the laughter of whites who, in their next breath, wouldn't hesitate to remind me of how post-racial we are and how Tarantino has every right to create art as he pleases and how brilliant he is, and on and on and on and on. I figured I might have a slavery flashback and go Nat Turner up in there, and that's not how I'm trying to go out. Instead of that unfortunate scenario, Mom and I headed to the movies in Atlanta on a Friday afternoon. Since my mother is a stickler for time, we got there early, and I did. I did a lot of people watching as the theater filled to capacity. Our fellow viewers were black, pretty much everyone as far as I could see, and largely grown. I'd say middle-aged and older. There were couples on dates, clusters of homegirls and homeboys, church sisters, and ladies who lunch. Not the crowd that generally thinks Reservoir Dogs is awesome, interestingly enough. I immediately felt at ease. I felt like I was at a family reunion where something dubious was about to happen, but that nevertheless it was going to be okay because my auntie and my mama were there. Weird, perhaps, but true. We all sat there in companionable semi-silence, because this was black people in the movie theater, so not completely silent, watching Tarantino's comedic spaghetti western slavery action comedy, cheering when racist slaveholders came to their timely and explosively bloody ends, sighing in satisfaction when Django finally got his girl, and laughing out loud at the absurdly funny scenes involving shit that generally is not funny at all. Take, for instance, a scene involving some Night Riders, or the forefathers of the KKK. The group arrives to kill Django and his white companion before they can get to the lynching. But before they can get to the lynching, there's a whole discussion about how their outfits, namely the poorly shaped eye holes on their white hoods, are getting in the way of their appointed task. They're dressed up in these hoods, and it's too small. They can't properly lynch because they can't see, right? It goes without saying that lynching is not funny. I mean, really, but the laughter reverberated throughout the theater. Not uncomfortable, tinny laughter that rings hollow and dies quickly in your throat, but genuine. People can be so damn foolish. You gotta laugh to keep from crying, and ain't this some shit? Laughter. Thundered throughout the theater. I don't know that I could have laughed during that moment in another theater, but I laughed heartily that day. I mean, it was ridiculous, and it was a well-done scene, but it's about lynching. When the movie was over, I asked my mom what she thought about it. She said she loved it. She loved that Django went about avenging people for his wife and that all the bad people got killed, especially Samuel Jackson old Uncle Ben looking ass. For her, it was the best kind of Western. When we went out to dinner that evening, she expressed several times how satisfying it was to watch racists get cut down. I could only agree. So what's my verdict on Django? It's interesting, frustrating, at times funny, violent, limiting, problematic, thought-provoking. It's doing a whole lot. I don't regret seeing it, but it's not in my top 10 list either. I think it is inciting interesting discussion, but I'm not naive enough to think that this will necessarily translate to a bunch of nuanced portrayals of black folk in slavery. What I do know is that my viewing experience was connected to where I saw the movie as much as it was connected to the film's content, and that, among other things, underscores my general ambivalence about the movie. Thank you.
Every semester for about 5 semesters, I've been an adjunct professor at Spelman teaching a poverty and social justice class. For the last 18 months, I've been working as the director of community engagement at Georgia Tech, and I specifically work with some of the most impoverished communities in Atlanta and in some states in Georgia. And so what I'm about to read to you is a post in process, because I'm always thinking about, like, at the beginning of my class, how to do something different, what new book is out, how we're going to talk about it, how we're going to make connections. And, you know, this time I feel like I have a little something extra that I didn't have before, which is interesting because you'll find out that I'm kind of new to Beyonce. If there's any way that one can be new to Beyonce, it's me, and they'll tell you. Okay, so this is entitled Angels and Ghosts. Every day I walk or drive through historic black neighborhoods in Atlanta, Georgia, where upwards of 50% of residential properties are vacant, abandoned, and sometimes burned down, but not demolished. I see empty buildings that used to be schools, recreation centers, community centers, and businesses. I see extraordinary flooding every time it rains, rushing water nearly covering the street. Sidewalks are non-existent or so torn up you cannot walk on them. So folks move through the middle of the street, parents with strollers and people in wheelchairs. On weekdays, I see elementary, middle, and high school age youth sitting on porches at 11 in the morning. I see groups of black men standing around at all times of the day and night. I see elders waiting at bus stops with no benches or shelters. I see stray dogs. I see people struggling with disabilities. I see people struggling with addictions and other ailments. I see people waiting in long lines at food distribution sites. I see community people working to serve the needs of those in their community. Angels. Every day I see poverty with a backdrop of downtown wealth and power. And I constantly have to remind myself that smart people design predatory lending, mortgage fraud programs, and strategies to suppress wages and downsize entire industries. The college educated, working for corporate law firms and elite colleges and universities and top consulting firms, develop models to privatize the public sector and underfund schools, transit, hospitals, public services, public safety, prisons, and more. Our best and brightest dreamed up revitalization programs promising better, safer housing and then leveled affordable housing, displaced entire communities of color, and triggered the rash of school closings we are still dealing with currently. But these brilliant people are absent in poor communities and so rarely held to account. Ghosts. So I'm new to Beyonce in that I'm nearly 40, and this is the first time I've purchased one of her albums. Just like she's starting to look into feminism, I'm starting to look into her lyrics, visual presence, and platform. I think her new visual album is groundbreaking, and 2 videos in particular stick with me as I think about how poverty, power, and action are represented in media. As an academic, my platform does not compare to Beyonce's, so I think it's significant that she seems to be inviting her followers to focus their attention on her process. In the No Angel video, she is putting her body in places that matter to make them more visible, like Michelle Obama has been doing since 2008. No Angel opens with the sun rising on the Houston skyline and quickly cuts to a black community where the built structures are in the background, such that substandard housing, deserted lots, and vacant properties inform but don't define the people in the video. She is making the familiar strange, telling the world that she sees what's happening in her hometown, Houston. No Angel is significant because it defies typical representations of black working class and low-income communities by foregrounding real people as subjects. Not just dancing, partying, pouring out liquor subjects, but daytime subjects with kids and interests. It's not about a glorification or judgment project. She is situating the people at the center of the narrative with a gender-conscious analysis, calling upon us to name the unnamed. You see glimpses of the backstage space of women's work and the remnants of violence showing through men's scars. There's a heavy feeling because the memorials, parents who bury their children are not widows or orphans. We don't have a name for them because that might suggest normalcy. But she spotlights these subjects. She makes them visible to us. In the second video, Ghost, Beyonce simply asks, "How come?" She is signaling a move towards using her global platform to make global connections and to ask critical questions. Questioning record labels. Questioning why people are working 9 to 5 just to stay alive. 9 to 5 just to stay alive. 9 to 5 just to stay alive. She is raising resistance and action as an option by resisting traditional channels of releasing an album and publishing an essay in the Shriver Report. Like I said, I'm new to Beyonce, but I appreciate that there are points of entry that invite me to interrogate her work and that she is making visible what I'm seeing daily, angels and ghosts.
What I thought I would do is just kind of moderate a conversation. When we get going, we'll sort of just play off of each other. But to get us started, so we've got different definitions of feminism. Cherie's post takes us to points of entry. Those points of entry being policy, being family life, being pop culture. And I think, so one of the questions is, what's our goal, right? Thinking about what we do as teaching, which I don't know that we always think about it in that way because it feels top down, right? So what's the goal of a blog, right? Why do it this way? I mean, we have access in all these other ways to doing work. We have classrooms, we have activist projects. So what's the end goal here, right, of digital pedagogy? What do you think?
I would say taking these things outside of the classroom is really the motivation, or my motivation. making it accessible for folk who are not in college, and who may never have that opportunity in that particular point of entry. So for me, the blog does that. It goes out farther than my spoken word can. Can
But
reach.
some folks use it in the classroom, right? So, I mean, it creates points of entry in the classroom, too, which is sort of interesting, right? Because that to me seems to be about power dynamics. And so one of the things that I sort of hear resonating, even Cherie is talking about, is a new point of entry, right? Or thinking about an object in a new way. Or the sort of point of entry. So to me, there's a couple things. One is about points of entry for other folks who are interested in getting into these dialogues. But on Isha's post, I feel like that post is you also intervening in a conversation that's going on elsewhere and saying, let me call you to account, right?
Yeah, it's so I mean the goal for me is in general in my work and in my life is sort of loosely defined movement building work. And so I'm always looking for spaces where I can have conversations that move towards building something. And the way that the blog for me plays into that is another site of engagement on the issues that I'm working on, which it looks very different than the other spaces that we're in. And actually we had a great conversation yesterday about online spaces as places where we do movement building work, and what are some of the real deep dangers and opportunities in those spaces. So one of the dangers is that you stay online and you don't do sort of grassroots on the ground work. That's a deep danger in thinking about digital spaces as sites of movement building. But one of the great opportunities is just this kind of intervention where, and there's a number of different things. Like, for example, we have been talking about how the things that we read in, there's something in the work I think that everybody read about sort of meeting people where they are, and the blog lets us create those points of entry. It also lets us move across different points of entry. So the piece that I wrote was in conversation with a movement that I'm a part of, and that I'm trying to have a conversation with, and wanting to have a critical engagement with that, right? So that's one way. Another way is I also wrote a post about the Mindy Project and my experiences of trying to watch the show and the sort of challenges that I had. And one of the and so it was a very exhausted and frustrated moment, and that comes out in the piece. And I've been thinking now about other ways to have a conversation about representations of South Asian women, particularly Mindy Kaling. So I think, one of the things, if we're talking about our goals, it's really one of the nice things and one of the potential dangers of a blog space is that those goals can become murky and conflated, and that we have to be really intentional. If we're doing what I did in that piece, which was, I linked to a lot of mainstream organizations and called them out for not taking on this question of the coercive sterilizations in California prison. That was a decision, that was a choice to use this space to make that kind of case, and to bring in other people in the CFC community into that. At other times, we do things like what Robin did, which is a very personal yet deeply resonant description of feminism. And so that one site can hold those two things is a great thing, and also really stressful at times, right? That is what is being put on a blog space.
Part of it is about trusting our readers, right? That they come with lots of different needs, but also, to draw this connection to what you're saying, Isha, with online pedagogy. My mother just finished her college degree, which I'm very proud of. Yes, yay, Mom.
Yes.
And she did part of it on site and then part of it online. But she talked about the way that folks would be on these online discussion boards, just talking sideways. And I'm Crunktastic, and she's the mother of Crunktastic. So you can imagine that it didn't always go well for people talking sideways to my mama online, But one of the things, because she would just be like, they don't know me. Why are they talking to me? She was very upset about this. But part of it is, one of the things we deal with, and I wonder about this when we're thinking about online pedagogy, is that it becomes so disembodied. Right. That people just get in the comments section and they want to take all their stuff out. They should be going to therapy. But instead, you're their punching bag. But also, so there's So that calling out thing can be interesting because the internet has a lot of calling out, right? Yeah. And at the same time, now that we have to actually listen to what other people have to say, we're not just dispensing, then a lot of what happens is that there's a tension, right? And that people are not, polite or civil or respectful. And so we're always having to negotiate what is our investment in that. Because those kind of terms are also used to police folks who have legitimate injuries and concerns. Like, women, you're being too emotional. If you would just say it to me in a nice way, then maybe I would listen to you. Tell me how I'm sexist, right? And if, and people do it around race work as well, around trans issues as well. I mean, we see it, in all of these spaces. So, but I have noticed that professors who teach online also have to think about that, right? How do you cultivate relationships with your students? Because it's one thing to tell somebody you disagree with them online when you never have to look them in the eye, right? It's another thing when you're sitting around a seminar room, and so people will say stuff online that they would never say to your face, right? And I'm always going to say it to my face, like, in one of my Twitter beefs this year, I said, say it to my face to some people. So
I think, going back to the history of the CFC, in which I'm talking about us getting crunk in classrooms, it was never yelling somebody down, or it was defending our positions, asserting ourselves, asserting our wholeness and our humanity. It wasn't like, I'm gonna mess you up and let me take that's not what it might involve that, but that's not what we're doing in classrooms, right? So I think that, we can be passionate about our stuff or whatever, but not, but still have a particular kind of ethic around engaging one another in real life and online that's respectful without sort of kowtowing to any in order for you to listen to me, I have to speak soft. No, I don't necessarily have to, but I don't have to abuse you to let you know I think you're wrong or I disagree with your position and so on, right? Because if we care about these communities, that we're not just critiquing, we're trying to build.
Right.
We're trying to build a more just world. We're not just trying to take folk out. You wrong, bye. It's actually, this is problematic. How can we build towards something that's more just?
And so I think that one of the things that gets really interesting is that, I know when I first came to feminism, what I saw was I had the right to critique something. It was like, ooh, like I can actually say something back, right? This idea of talking back. And it was different. I mean, at that point, when I came to women's studies, we were just getting email addresses. And so, talking back wasn't necessarily what it is now. And now that, we've been talking about this conversation, we've been having this conversation on the politics of engagement. There are a couple of different pieces to that, right? There's self-care, right? Because we did end up very early on, people being like, oh, CFC, such and such happened. They said something, get them. And it was just like,
When did that?
we ain't got that.
And it was one of those things where, there was this assumption that somebody's going to swoop in and say the thing that needed to be said and fly away. And it's like, that's actually not what we're interested in. And quite frankly, if we're doing the talking back and we're being strategic about it, then it might create a space for somebody to come and actually engage in the dialogue as opposed to feeling like they got told. And the other piece that we also got into was internally, some people are going to say things in the comments. It doesn't necessarily mean that you spend your day trying to teach them why they need to be reading Audre Lorde or anything else, or why they just need to go somewhere and sit down. That expends a lot of energy. That expends a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of energy out of you. And while we do the work online, we also live in the world around us, right? And trying to hold both of those, I think, is significant and important. But we have to be very mindful of the fact that there's a lot of energy that can be expelled in that way. And so trying to figure out how we do what mode of engagement makes sense for what thing, picking battles, if they're battles, seeing points of entry, right? Seeing ways to actually elevate or invite people. Because I think that's one of the things that our conversation moved to last night was, if we want people to be attracted to some of the things that we think that are important, then we have to make it so that it's accessible, and we have to make them want to engage with us.
I mean, and part of that, though, is also about us trying to integrate it into our own lives, right? So I think we also write about the stuff that interests us. So it's not even just kind of a contrived, so now we need to put up a post about the Real Housewives of Atlanta. It's like, no, we're watching the Real Housewives of Atlanta.
Right.
We're, in fact, watching that. And thinking about at every moment, what does it mean that we like this representation, even though we know it ain't quite right, you know? Or you're watching Love and Basketball. I mean, Love and Hip Hop. Well, Love and Basketball too, but Love and Hip Hop.
I watch Love and Basketball.
Yeah, that's my joint. But you're watching Love and Hip Hop. You know, Love and Hip Hop Atlanta, the first season was really my joint. You know, and so then, you know, we're trying to, you know, create concepts. So that was a show where I was like, well, let's think. Well, they real ratchet. And then, so I came out with a post called Ratchet Feminism, which is about Love and Hip Hop Atlanta. That's all about, you know, sort of working class resistance, but what we also saw was women taking care of each other. Unlike some shows, these women weren't all about taking each other down. There was a lot of conversation and a lot of negotiation happening. So we're trying to see the places where people really live out the questions, right?
Yeah.
And not just, and so this is the thing that I've also kind of been thinking about. We are sitting here having this conversation at Rutgers. We're mostly academics. We're all highly academically trained. So what does it mean to take academic feminism into an online space? Because there's this politics around things sounding right. You know, we want everybody to talk like they've been reading Mahanti, Patricia Hill Collins, Judith Butler before they got on this blog post and got in the comment section, right? And so how do we check our own kind of academic access if we think feminism is an accessible project for other people, right? What do y'all think?
So that makes me think of Robin's post, right? And again, some knowing the importance of naming, right? And knowing that just because you don't necessarily latch onto the name doesn't necessarily mean there aren't connections to be made. And I certainly appreciate the fact that we try to look for instances that are already there, that people are already connected to, and try to read it in a different way, as opposed to, again, just being in the project of tearing down, but also in the project of identifying places where we see the things that, you know, resonate for a number of different people, but name it, and say, this is actually connected. You can see a connection. These are some of the things that folks are talking about, particularly, you know, in Black feminist traditions. Talking back is a huge piece of it. You have the right to do that. And so lifting out moments where people might be saying they're just arguing with each other or something, you know, inane is happening, and actually saying, no, that's not what's happening. This is somebody who's standing up for themselves. This is somebody who is actually lifting up a way of being in the world, and they don't necessarily have to walk around and say, I'm feminist, but you can say, I identify that as something, that as a connection to my feminism. I think that is rich, and that kind of levels the playing field a little bit more, such that we're not necessarily in control of who gets to be feminist and who doesn't.
So part of what we're trying to talk about, we're wanting to bring together a few things. One, sort of this politics of engagement. So there's been a really nasty, terrible, horrible, no good backlash against Beyonce claiming feminism. And I'm being very clear about that, because it's not that they're not critiques of Beyonce. It's just that those critiques are not rigorous. So the most popular feminist post against her was a group of grad students who called her a bottom bitch feminist. Wow. Mm-hmm. And that post went viral. Everyone's talking about it. And here's one of the things we're saying, right? Consider possibly that Beyonce may very well have read that post. Right? She's scrolling through YouTube for videos on feminism.
I guarantee she has like a Google alert or something, right? Or somebody does about, right? Her assistant, somebody's scrolling through, because that's the thing about online stuff.
And this is, and I just always like to drop this and then move on, right? But this is how we know. We know that celebrities read blogs now. How do we know? Tyler Perry called my house in June.
Yeah.
Tyler Perry. That Tyler Perry read a post at the Crunk Feminist Collective and then called my house to talk to me about his movies. For 40 minutes, Tyler and I talked about his movies. I'm not lying. I'm telling you the truth. Tyler Perry, Medea, called, because I wrote a post called Tyler Perry Hates Black Women. Right? Talib Kweli, the rapper Talib Kweli and I, we're not getting along because I wrote a post calling him a sexist. They read this stuff. So what does that mean for us as feminists, right? You have somebody saying, I I'm interested in feminism. And we can't never get nobody to say that. I mean, really. Y'all know the first day of intro, right? You're like, how many identifiers? Well, I'm a feminist, but I'm not a feminist, but I want equal rights. I want to be able to do what I want with my body, but I'm not a feminist, right? So we've had this moment, and then you got somebody saying, Beyonce. Now, she rich, she married, she got all the trappings. And so what? Why would she want this term now? Right?
So, we had a whole conversation about this yesterday too, and I actually think that there are some very legitimate critiques of this album from a feminist standpoint, and also for the sort of model that Beyonce uses of, it's capitalist in its very core. There is something transgressive about releasing the album the way that she did. I don't know that she has lost any money though. It's just like
my money.
That's right. She got Cherie's money for the first time.
She got
But that notwithstanding, I mean, the structure of celebrity and the way that celebrity is sort of makes money and interacts with capitalism is like a legitimate critique. As is, I think there's a whole conversation to be had about feminists liking sex and that being a key narrative in this album. Of course, in the context of married sex for her, there's a conversation to be had there, right, about her sexual liberation happening in the context of marriage and with this child and what she's having there, which I think that is both transgressive and problematic. Both of those things are happening. So there is a conversation to be had with Beyonce. And so when we say engagement, we're not just talking about Beyonce might read things and she might not, but a lot of people are coming to feminism through her in a way that they would not be without that. So then we're in a space where we can engage critically with what she's saying, but also create an opening for more conversation. Mm-hmm. So that's that's a really hard line to walk, right? Where do you sort of say, this is actually really destructive, and we're going to engage with it, and we're going to do the taking down and calling out, and then where do you say, this is an opportunity, and what we're going to do here is engage in a different way with it. And for us, I think, and for different ones of us at different times, it's about audience, it's about content, it's about what feels right in that moment for our own feminist practice, and how we respond to those things. And so I think, I mean, the piece that sort of, there's several pieces that are sort of critiquing Beyonce from a feminist perspective. Some of them have a very hateful tone. So now you have this sort of world of people who are engaging with Beyonce and her kind of coming into feminism, who could find that quite easily online, and then now all of a sudden it's like, well, if Beyonce can't be a feminist and I can't be a feminist, I mean, there's any number of conversations that happens. And so this is where I think the movement building piece for me comes back, is like, what is the conversation we're having, and with whom, and to what end are we doing the critiquing also?
And why? Why are we doing what we're doing?
Right, and I think the other piece that we talked about is being able to have your process, right? So I always remember my first women's studies class at Spelman. I was from the South. I had very serious, limited racial analysis. I didn't have names for stuff. I definitely did not have a gender analysis, and it took time. So what happens if you're a celebrity and you say, I'm interested in it? There's no time, right? You're either perfectly feminist, if there's any such thing, right, or you're just not.
Well,
and so
there's no room for growth.
Exactly.
And there's also a problem of scholarly rigor, right? Which is a thing that I wrote a post called 5 Reasons I'm Here for Beyonce the Feminist, but one of the points of that post was academic feminism is not the only feminism there is, right? And I don't and anyone who's had my class or knows me knows I hate bad argumentation. And I feel like a lot of the folks with their legitimate critiques of Beyonce, it's not legitimate, it's hateration. And it's hateration because I think it's some old she's the cool girl and we're the radical chicks. And never the twain shall meet. Because some of our stuff is not as righteous as we try to make it be. And we have to have that conversation in movement building too, which is, you can have that conversation in blog space in a way that you can never have it in the classroom. And look, I'm not saying that everyone who has a problem with the Beyonce album just is hated. That is not the argument at all. I'm saying the arguments that have been put forth are not good arguments because they assume things like that to be feminist is to be anti-capitalist, which is not true in the intellectual history of feminism. To be a radical feminist is to be anti-capitalist, right? But just mainstream, I believe in equality, is just good old regular liberal American mainstream feminism, right? And if all of y'all are acting like you came to feminism and were like, I just want to live in a commune and I don't want to make my paper, you're lying. And I want my paper because I have student loans and people are coming to my house. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, I just feel like we're not having an honest conversation about what we mean when we say feminist. And that is not, it's not, and so when I know that there are folks who are sitting in women's studies classrooms and they not being honest, then that lets me know that it's not about rigor and it's not about legit critique, it's about emotion. Because you can point to the books in feminist theory that disagree with your position, right? And you're not engaging in that stuff, you're just saying she a bottom bitch. Which means that really you just wanted to call Beyonce a bottom bitch and then you dressed it up as feminist critique.
Ooh.
And we call that kind of stuff out.
But I think, going back to the history of the CFC, and I think, the history of women's studies programs and sort of black studies programs and ethnic studies programs, we're trying to have particular kinds of conversations. They're rooted in actual movements, right? Movements to end oppression. But part of it starts with these different points of entry so that we can have conversations and build community. And I feel like that's really important. And regardless of how we feel about Beyonce, I feel like conversations are happening around this. Like, well, what does it mean? And okay, why did she come here at this point? And is she pimping, feminism for pay? No, but is she doing that? Whatever. We're having these conversations. How can we do it? Right. So I feel like these conversations are important. I was saying to the folks last night that when I went home to Fort Lauderdale for the holidays, I was just sitting with a couple of friends from high school. We're all different educational levels. We have all different kinds of life experience. What yokes us is that we all went to high school together. We're 30-something-year-old black women. And, we're just kicking it, playing cards, talking shit, and listening to Beyonce and actually having the visual album on in the background. And then my two friends who have not read any Audre Lorde, no bell hooks, no nothing, they were like, well, this is what I think about feminism. And I feel like I'm a feminist in this way and blah, blah, blah. And I never come to conversations like, well, I'm Dr. Morris. And they knew me when I was just Susanna and I lived on whatever side of town and I walked home with them. So there's no fronting. They're not impressed, right? So that wasn't a thing like I have to bring this kind of conversation. This was initiated by my friends, who are women from various walks of life. And I feel like these are the conversations that are having while people are playing cards and drinking and talking about the men and the women that they're dating or whatever is going on with the kids in the kitchen and all that just regular life stuff. These are the conversations. Like the post that you were talking about, Robin, I feel like these are different iterations of the conversations that our mothers and aunties and grandmothers have. But now the word feminism is being brought up because the stuff is like, girl, did you download the latest Beyonce album? Yes, I did. Well, I'm a feminist because, I don't believe in that word or whatever. These conversations are happening. And I feel like we can't dismiss them even if Beyonce is the catalyst. We want folk to be having the conversations. That doesn't mean we throw Audre Lorde out with the bathwater, but maybe this can get us with the conversation started and maybe we can go to that, or maybe not. Maybe we don't need to have every single person read Audre Lorde. I love her, but are we having these conversations about wholeness, about selfhood, about relationships, about our process, around all these other things? Like, these things seem really important and they can't solely be academic. And I feel like that story that you told about Barbara Smith, we need to talk. That's a good.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna quip and say, partition and rocket will get you to the uses of the erotic much quicker than Audre Lorde ever will.
Well.
Anyway, y'all just go listen. Just go listen.
Well.
And blow. Can't, because we gotta have both sides. Yeah, blow and partition.
That's right. That's right.
And then rocket.
That's right.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
You watched all of these last night.
When the very first CFC panel that we ever did was part of a conference where we were honoring Barbara Smith, who's one of the members of the Combahee River Collective. So somebody in the audience said, what does feminism mean? And we were like up here talking about, and then my grandmama was a feminist and my mama and identity, which we're down for clearly still. And Barbara Smith was sitting in the audience and finally she just looked up and she said, feminism is an oppression, is a movement to end actual oppression. Like, no one had said feminism is a movement, and no one had said oppression. People had talked about identity.
And feelings.
Yeah.
And
You know, and
feelings.
it's about my choices and my
Yeah.
body and self-empowerment and all this stuff. And she was like, it's a movement to end actual oppression. I will never forget that because it hipped me to something that's happening in feminism. It's also happening in intersectionality scholarship, like we talked about this a bit. Where everybody's talking about this stuff as though we're talking about identity politics and as though we're not trying to do any kind of movement building. So, you know, the move in the academy now for my grad students in the room is, you know, we post intersectionality now. We talked about this a lot in my graduate seminar. You know, folks want to move post intersectionality. I'm not with it. Let me tell you why. Because, in short, if you read all of the critiques, the folks who are moving post intersectionality are making one primary intellectual error. And that intellectual error is they keep saying we need to move past intersectionality because it's a bad account of identity, which it is. It's not a good account of identity, but it was never meant to be an account of identity. It was meant to be an account of how structures of power interact. So it's the difference between talking about racism, sexism, classism, and race, gender, and class. See, those are not the same words. See how they're not the same words? Right. So people who are like post-intersectionality are talking about, because I want a better way to talk about my identity. That's great. You do that. Right? But that doesn't mean intersectionality is not profound in terms of its ways of talking about racism, sexism, and classism having multiplicative effects in terms of marginalizing people. So it is an account of power, right? The same thing's happening in feminism, right? We're doing the same thing. You know, so people are like, well, what do you mean when you say a feminist? I mean that I want women to be able to move. I want all people, right? Women being at the women, cis, trans, right? Poor, rich. I want women to have the full range of human options around how they move, a life of choices, right? Access to material resources, safety, right? The ability to determine if they want families and what kind of families they want. See what I'm saying? That's movement stuff. That's not, I want to feel fluffy on Saturdays and free about my Friday nights. Like, yes, and, right? It's a much broader vision. And so one of those things is about so I think young people resist us about feminism because it sounds like they have to take on an identity, right? Like taking on a religion. And so what we know is that you can't be it perfectly all the time, which is why folks resist. Right? Because it's like, well, what? Because look at what we've done to poor Beyonce. She, you know, I mean, but she is poor Beyonce in the sense that what we know is that there's things that feminism can do for her that capitalism can never do. If we actually believe that, though, we have essentially said, since you want capitalism, you don't get to have feminism. And that's on us. That's not on her, right? So, poor Beyonce, look at what we've done to her. We've said this identity is off limits to you, right? And that's about identity politics and not movement building. And so Isha asked last night when we were talking about this, are we really trying to build a movement? Like, what kind of world are we trying to build? And it's not because I mean, look, I like B. I didn't always like her. I like her because I think she's trying, and I'm here for folks who are trying, right, and who are willing to evolve. That's my sort of stake in the game, is about women, and particularly women of color, being able to have access to liberation discourse. Else, what are we doing? Right?
So on Wednesday, I was in a room with some parents who are trying to organize to keep a school open in one of the communities that I work in. And those, you know, we were trying to get at what, you know, it's not just about keeping the school open. It's about keeping the school open with and it functioning in the way that gives you what you want out of the school, out of the building, that it serves the community in a particular way. And what, you know, they were not interested in my feminisms or any of my scholarship. They were interested in being able to craft a language to be able to be heard. And so the fact that you have at 5:30 on a Wednesday, folks coming in, kids sitting out to the side trying to figure this out, and literally if you go outside of this building and look up and over, you will see downtown Atlanta, right? But if you walk down this street, which on one end of James P. Brawley goes through Clark Atlanta University into Spelman College, and on the other end, if you walk through it, you would be scared. Burnt out buildings that kids have to walk past every day, you name it. But they're saying we are staying here. We have generations who've lived here. I went to this school. My cousins went to this school. We have a particular thing related to this school. And when it was open for the simple fact of both educating, but it also provided public services. It had on-site childcare. It had all these things right there that people needed. And it did not go away because parents decided they didn't care about the school anymore. It went away because of decisions that were being made less than half a mile away from them. So if, in fact, we're not figuring out a way to create the space for folks to figure out this is not just what's going on here with me, this is what's happening nationally, this is what's happening across town, this has something to do with who I am, what I look like, right, what my histories are. If we are not able to like make those connections or at least help facilitate those conversations, then it doesn't matter, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And I, for me, always trying to kind of figure out how we can take as much as we can of the things that people are figuring out, sitting in small rooms, trying to come up with names to make the connection so that people can hear it and connect with it. Like, that is part of my reason for being as engaged as I am at more of a national level, because I'm trying to hear what is working there that we can bring here. Like, how are you talking about it there that we can talk about here? Are there literacy issues? How are you dealing with literacy issues? It is a very practical figure this out so that we don't have people feeling so completely helpless when they're sitting in the midst of so many assets and resources and can't get their hands on it. So, when we start talking about what are we trying to build, we are trying to build like the environment where folks have the basics and can build upon that and can do for themselves and can speak for themselves. And right now, that's not what it is. As much as we have the integration of images and on mainstream media, as much as we have folks talking a good talk, the policy agenda is moving ahead and more things are getting cut. And people are not necessarily understanding why they have to fight for this on Monday and this on Tuesday and this on Wednesday and this on Thursday and this on Friday and come on Saturday morning and then on Sunday try to pray and figure out what you're going to do when you start. Like, they don't understand why they're having to go in all these different directions. And there's a way that we can help people talk about this, that they can see that those things are connected. Like, that the school is a real estate deal. It's not just about education, it's about housing. It's not just about housing, it's about the fact that all these companies went away and people don't have jobs. And, all of that stuff is connected. We have a way to help talk about that, but if we don't figure out a way to articulate it and invite people in to be able to have those conversations, what's the point? Like, I got this education for a reason, and it wasn't because I thought there was going to be like fame and anything else, right? There's a whole, like she said, there's a whole lot of debt. But if it's not about figuring out these problems, then I'll do something else has to happen.
Last week, I was doing a HuffPost Live conversation about violent videos against black girls, circulation of these videos of black girls beating each other up. And that video was circulating. It's like the kind of thing that you might have even seen at CFC in one capacity or another. And then, so one of the things I'm thinking as I'm listening to Cherie is about our accountability structures, right? Because this panel is called Teaching and Being Taught. Mm-hmm. So we don't get to just, we're not just out here dispensing knowledge, right? We're also learning from each other and from the folks who come and check us. But also, part of this ethics of engagement seems, is about not just celebrities who read you or whatever, but when I was on that HuffPost conversation and I was so upset about these scholars not wanting to take an ethical stance about all this circulation of images of violence. And so this is a video of a little black girl, she's a teenager, who her supposed friend just came up out of the blue and punched her in the face, and their other friends were taping it and they put it on YouTube. It got tens of millions of views. And then they turned it into an internet meme called the Sharkeisha videos. Because Sharkeisha just punches the shit out of this girl, and there's no other way to say it. It's really a horrendous thing to see. And the little girl who she punched, her name is Shamichael. So I'm like on Huffington Post going in with professors and rappers about their stances on this. And then as I get off the video and it comes out a couple days later, my older cousin, who is like a brother to me, says, oh, I know that girl's mama. And I was like, well, whose mama? And he was like, the girl that got punched. Her mama is one of his clients in his business. So now we're at CFC, we're doing, we're going to do something for her. Like we do care packages. We do love letters to folks. I'm going to be in her city next week and and I'm going to try to meet with her. So there's also a real so I don't just get on TV and online and talk about violence against black girls and how terrible it is in the abstract, because now I have to go sit with the little girl that got punched out. And then what is my intervention with her, right? Is it just I'm building, and that's the thing we would talk about. Is my goal to build a relationship? Is my goal feminism, rah, 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 to save your life and keep from getting punched out? I don't think that's true. Like, but there is a way that it's the thing we were talking about with blended learning, right? That it's not just the online stuff facilitates real work in the offline world, right? Where we then have to go sit in these spaces and be accountable for the stuff that we say that matters. So I could get all kinds of cool points for towing the feminist line, but the larger, more important conversation is when I sit down and look her in the face, what does that experience mean for her? And what are all these tools? If these tools don't give her anything, then they don't mean anything, right?
And that's why I think we use the term percussive, because percussive is not a passive positionality, right? You're sort of affecting and being affected by the thing that you're engaging with. And so I think for us, that is a key element of Crunk Feminism, is that it is in dialogue with feminisms of different kinds, and that we are both engaging with it and also affected by it. And I think that's a pedagogical structure and strategy that is different than the sort of top-down, we're here to communicate a particular lens on the world to you, which we do sometimes, but it is always in the context of creating more space and being in dialogue, which is actually makes the online space a really difficult place. I mean, there's been all of these assessments of what comes out from people when they are behind their computer screens. So our comment sections, as our blog's readership has grown beyond sort of our initial kind of small, largely feminist of color community who was reading us, a few years ago, the conversations were very different, and there was an engagement with people who were kind of where we were, and we sort of had a different, and now sort of we have a growing readership, and so the comments are different, and sometimes they're very vitriolic and they're very hateful, and so it's always a negotiation. It's not as though we have a fixed set of rules about how we decide, and I think it might, and sometimes it's different for different ones of us, right? That if I've written something, I generally don't do, just for lack of hours in the day, I don't do a lot of engagement in the comment sections. I'll respond to questions or clarifications, and I am often affected by things that people say, and I pay attention to them, but I don't do a back and forth, whereas other ones of us actually have really interesting conversations online with people who are commenting. We have a sort of like, we're not going to tolerate hateful stuff, or we have, like, it's very strict. I mean, we have a policy on commenting, and that's how we've decided that there are some things that are non-negotiables for us. So we actually will not try to convince you to not say racist, sexist things. Like, we're just going to delete that, right? Because it's a space that we're creating. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting about doing political work in an online space, particularly anti-racist feminist work in an online space, because it brings out all of the bad, and it's right there, and then it's a question of negotiating it. And it's not even always in folks who are in opposition. Sometimes it's members of our own community who will say things, and then you're sort of in the position of saying, okay, this conversation is happening here. How do we choose to engage with something that is potentially really painful? And sometimes those things move offline. Sometimes they stay online. It's just a constant negotiation. And I think imagining that there are rules that one can apply universally across the board to online feminist practice is maybe our first problem. Maybe it's our second problem. The first one was that there's a notion of feminism that we all share, and that we can use sort of without critique.
I think that largely a lot of that would be negotiated offline. As a collective, we are committed to supporting each other, and defending each other's individual belief, because I think as a collective there shouldn't be an expectation that we are a monolith, and that we all think about things the same way. And one of the benefits of a collective, I believe, is the possibility of having multiple voices and experiences and perspectives represented equally, and then engaging across those differences instead of, having pushback. So I think as a collective, we're committed to having a public representation of inclusivity, and if it so happens that I'm not sure how often that happens, but if someone were to post something, we have an opportunity to have, offline conversations about that, and public conversations in which, someone might write another response, not necessarily a rebuttal. A couple of years ago, we engaged in what we called, side B, what is it?
B-side. Yeah,
B-side, the B-side, so because it's not so much that someone might think of something and it's wrong, it just may be different than how you thought about it. So instead of challenging them and saying, that's wrong, sis, it's like, well, okay, this is how you think about that. Let me flip it and tell you how I think about it. And then those voices can then be in conversation instead of in battle.
But we've definitely had growing pains. I mean, the collective has shifted and changed. And we have had disagreements with one another. I mean, it's like a sisterhood, and sometimes sisters fight.
Family fights, yes.
Yeah.
But I think our shared politic is that those things because we have relationships with each other, and not just relationships, we have friendships with each other, that those things come first for us as a collective. I think that's what makes us different from being sort of an aggregate of bloggers or an aggregate of intellectuals, is that we actually spend time with each other and have relationships with each other and friendships with each other, so that when a moment comes where we want to have a conversation about someone's perspective or something someone's written or anything like that, that we actually have a foundation upon which to stand to have that conversation. And doesn't have to be destructive.
Or combative.
Right.
It's not an argument. It's just, I don't think about it that way.
Which is actually an excellent movement building principle.
Yeah.
That you can sort of find ways to build relationships so that you can talk across difference. And I think that's the only way that it's going to work. I mean, if we're waiting for everyone to share our feminism exactly as we define it in order to build a movement against sexism and racism, then this is never going to work. It's not,
That's right.
Well, Isha and I did a video about after we saw it together with my mom, because I go to the movies with my mom all the time. So I thought it was really interesting, and I thought about 12 Years a Slave as I was sort of finishing up reading this piece, because it was written so long before I even knew that film was coming out. I think it's interesting. Carol Boyce Davies wrote a really interesting piece about, I think, the nuances of it in The Guardian, I want to say it was published. But bottom line, I think 12 Years a Slave is interesting. I think it's worth watching. I think people should read the book. People should just be reading slave narratives in general, but I'm glad that it's a particular kind of intervention. But I would recommend anybody who's interested in it to look at Davies' piece, because she brings up points about resistance, slave resistance, that the film sort of elides, that the narrative doesn't. But most folk, I get, are not generally picking up slave narratives, even though now 12 Years a Slave is sort of in bookstores with Chiwetel Ejiofor's face, or he's running, I think, on the cover. It's like the movie poster, and so I think more people will be reading, but I think it's a good intervention. I just hope there will be more films that show multiple perspectives. So.
I was also thinking in terms of context and movie going.
Oh yeah, so we saw it at the Art House Cinema
in Atlanta.
And I did feel some kind of way about that, because I was like, ooh, the hipsters. No shade to any hipsters are here. I love everybody, but I just was like, I'm not really, I'm not sure. But everyone was affected, you know. I mean, and it wasn't in a kind of irreverent film like Django. I just was in all my feelings about Tarantino. I understand that he's people love him and think he's great. I personally don't. And also, I think my sort of, what do you sometimes just refer to yourself as a humorless feminist? I don't refer to myself as one. I think lots of crass things are funny, but she does not. For me, Tarantino is where my respectability politics begin or something. I'm like, oh no, that's not funny. I can't, So for me, that's why I wanted to write about context, because I felt like if I'd seen that, maybe even by myself, I might have felt some kind of way. I mean, maybe that's why I hate Pulp Fiction or something, because I watched it alone and was like, what happened? No. But I feel like watching movies is a community project, you know? It's not just watching it by yourself.
We had a whole conversation before going to see 12 Years a Slave because
sure
both of
did.
us were expecting a different thing, both as a reaction to because I think the only scene I had seen from the movie before that was the one with Lupita Nyong'o and the soap, right? So that's the only scene that you see as like a trailer to the film. You expect a certain kind of film experience, and the film was actually, there are a lot of pauses in the movie and a lot of, so there's a lot, it actually in some ways took better care of us than I expected it to. And we also went with your mom. And so we had actually made a plan to talk about it afterwards.
Yeah.
And so I had like a self-care strategy around going to see the film.
Yeah.
I think, so that was like the movie-going experience, but we also talked about what it means that it's the first time a slave narrative has been made in a film in this way, and that it's largely British production. And so we had sort of a conversation about that, which we put up. We did a video chat and we put it on the CFC about the film.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point. I would agree with you to a certain extent that we have folk like Bachman or Sarah Palin talking about, I'm a member of Feminists for Life, sort of anti-choice feminism, if those things can go together, which we can make various arguments about. But I think the difference I see with Beyonce is, and I'm definitely not a scholar of super right conservative, so I would definitely bend to your expertise. I'm not sure that Michelle Bachman and Sarah Palin got poor white women or sort of mainstream average white women that sort of might be their target audience to go out and all of a sudden start calling themselves feminists. I don't know that Beyonce has gotten black women of all stripes to start calling themselves feminists either. Maybe. I think she's gotten some more, but I feel like her global level of stardom, it's kind of hard to compare in some ways. So I do think that her feminism certainly aids in her rebranding, but I think she could have rebranded herself in any number of other ways, and to take a DJ, not to take like Lean In, right? Because I feel like to me, that would make more sense for Beyonce, like Sheryl Sandberg, like that would be like, she literally would be reading that book and be like, that's how I'm gonna run my company, that's how I'm running it now. I'm not sure of bringing up a DJ though, that kind of feminine, that's a really particular kind of like black woman story. And for Beyonce to latch on to that, I think that makes me think it's more than just rebranding. Like, she went immediately to Walmart and started handing out gift cards, so let's not get it twisted. Like, she's about her coins in a very specific kind of way. But I think pulling in a DJ is like,
because she had to scroll past lots of white women talking about feminism when she typed in feminism on YouTube to get to a DJ, right?
Right.
Because you get a DJ now, but then you get white woman after white woman after white woman talking about feminism. So the fact that she even goes for a woman of color defining that in really, I think, diasporic ways, which is also very interesting too.
Well, and there's a question about like whether and how, and I don't actually want to diminish the power of feminism or of talking about women in the way, because I have seen the conservative, like I've seen that language come up, and it usually shows up in the form of protection, like sort of like, well, we want to protect women against these horrible feminist things. Like we want to protect women against abortion, which causes breast cancer or whatever, all those things that sort of come up as like forms of feminism. The question is like, at least for me, I think, I see the way that sort of conservative movement is happening as being mercenary in a different way than maybe what Beyonce is doing, which is specifically about, to my mind, the women's vote, right? Like that, those numbers, that the sort of right wing talking about women at all started happening when there was the numbers were shifted, right? So that's not to say that there isn't actually, I think Sarah Palin is interesting, and I imagine she has had to contend with a lot of sexism. Right,
certainly.
And so that it's not that it's inauthentic, but I feel like there's a sort of way that is politically mercenary, and the strategy is geared towards the politics. Whereas I don't know actually about Beyonce. I'm not convinced that it's one way or the other yet about her. Yeah. So.
And I think the thing to say,
it could be both.
Well, I think the thing to say about standing is a fair amount of standing goes on. And look, and what I say to people is I'm a champion for black women. Like, unapologetically, right? Because I think there are very few people who will even take that stance. I think it's a political stance. But what I'm also committed to is a certain kind of rigor around what I'm championing. So that means, like I'm not going to support stuff that I think is problematic or what have you, but I'm interested in us creating space for Black women to have certain kind of conversations, right? So I'm interested in people of our generation and our age actually thinking about what it means to be feminist outside of the academy. I think Beyonce opens up that conversation and wants to make space for herself there. I think that you get shows like Being Mary Jane or Scandal, and I think that for all the problems with those shows, what I see is vulnerable women trying to negotiate the realities of being professional women in relationships. And no one else is ever interested. Like, we've never, ever seen anyone be interested in that. And then I think that Black women are, like, so hard on other Black women. Like, people were like, I'm breaking up with Mary Jane after episode 1. And I just thought, really? Like, so we hadn't had a Black drama on TV in 40 years with a Black female lead, all Black female cast, or ever really. That's a 1-hour scripted drama, but you breaking up after 1 episode? Because what? Like... And we don't do that with any other kind of shows. We'll hang in. We have guilty pleasures. We'll, and we don't have, and the or the notion that we can just view these shows artistically, right? And we don't have to have a political investment. I'm sort of clear that all of this shit is political, right? And that I am watching the show because I have a political investment in being able to see myself, right? And so if that means that I make more space than folks who are sort of true and objective critics, fuck it. That's fine. Like, at the end of the day, I want the space, not the right to claim the sort of sanctimony and righteousness of my critique, right? And other people may fall on the other side of that, right? They may want the sort of righteousness of critique without, and then their argument is, I don't want the space unless it's right. And I don't think humanity works like that. And so I think that there are some drawing of lines in the sand. But I also tell people all the time, too, but challenge me at the level of my argument, though. And I just don't feel like I've seen anyone challenge my Beyonce post at the level of argument and do it well. And yes, it was an arrogant statement. It's also a true one.
I think it is too. I think
And with that,
She woke up like this.
and we're done, y'all.
Thank you.